I've been a park ranger in Mount Hood National Forest for over a decade, and nothing has ever truly shaken me. Sure, there are the occasional lost hikers or wild animal sightings, but nothing out of the ordinary. That all changed a few weeks ago. It started with a missing persons report. A hiker had gone out alone on the Timberline Trail, and his wife called in a panic. He was supposed to be back by 5 p.m., but it was now 7, and he wasn't answering his phone. Something about her voice, frantic, desperate, told me this wasn't just a case of someone losing track of time. I volunteered for the night patrol to search for him. The air was cold and thick with fog, and the trees loomed like silent sentinels, blocking out most of the moonlight. As I ventured deeper into the woods, an unfamiliar unease settled in my chest. It was too quiet. The usual sounds of rustling leaves or animal calls were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence. Following the trail, each step crunching on frost-covered ground, I felt the silence pressing in around me. Normally, distant owls or small creatures rustling in the underbrush would offer some sense of life. But tonight, it was as if the forest was holding its breath. Then I found it. Frantic footprints veering off the trail, leading deeper into the forest. The prints were erratic, as though the person had been running or stumbling in blind panic. I crouched to examine them, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The boot prints were unmistakable, solid, worn tread. But something was wrong. The ground around the footprints was disturbed, torn up as if something had been dragged alongside them. I followed the trail further, my heart pounding as I spotted something worse. A second set of prints. Larger, much larger, and not human. These prints were deep, unnaturally wide, with toes splayed out like claws. The earth around them was gouged as though whatever made them moved with immense weight and power. A cold sweat began to form, but I couldn't turn back now. I needed answers. The prints led further off the path, into the darkest parts of the forest. The fog thickened, the air grew heavier, and for the first time in years I regretted being out here alone. At the edge of a steep hillside, I hesitated, my boots slipping on loose rocks as I followed the prints downward. The earth seemed to shift beneath my feet with every step. Then I saw it. A scrap of clothing caught on a branch, frayed at the edges, stained with something dark. The fabric looked disturbingly familiar, but I pushed that thought aside, focusing on what I saw next. The footprints of both the hiker and the creature were now perfectly aligned, as though whatever it was had been stalking the hiker, step by agonizing step. This wasn't a chance encounter, it was a hunt. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself as the weight of the situation sank in. Turning back wasn't an option. I had to find out what was out here and if I could help whoever was still out there. As I moved further along the trail, careful not to lose the prints, a scream pierced the silence. Distant but unmistakable, a cry of pure terror. The sound sent a shockwave through my chest, freezing me in place. And then I heard something else, a low, guttural roar, far deeper than any animal I'd ever heard. But it wasn't just a roar. It was layered with the scream, as if the creature was so close it was drowning out the hiker's cries. The sounds twisted together, sending a chill down my spine. I didn't hesitate. I ran. My hand instinctively found the cold metal of my firearm beneath my jacket. It didn't bring much comfort, but it was all I had. I told myself that if the hiker was still alive, maybe the gun could make a difference. If I could reach him in time, if I could stop whatever was out there. The forest seemed to grow quieter as I ran, the pounding of my own breath drowning out everything else. My pulse thundered in my ears, each step pushing me forward. I had to focus. I had to find him. I slowed, my chest tightening as I tried to steady my breath. My heart was pounding too loudly, drowning out the sounds that had been guiding me. I strained to hear anything, but the woods had returned to an unnatural silence. No more screams, no more growls, just the crunch of my own footsteps. The gully opened up, and the fog thickened around me. A primal instinct told me something was very wrong. I stepped into a small clearing, shining my flashlight across the ground, scanning for any signs of life. My stomach twisted when I saw it. The unmistakable signs of a struggle, broken branches, trampled ground, torn up dirt. And then another piece of fabric, blood-stained and torn to shreds, lying discarded in the grass. I couldn't breathe for a moment as I crouched down beside it. The fabric was too familiar. It was the same as the scrap I'd found earlier, This was real. The hiker had been here, and they were hurt. I fought to stay calm, but my mind was racing. This person wasn't just lost, they were being hunted. I could feel it deep in my gut, that sickening certainty. I had to keep going, had to find them before it was too late. As I scanned the clearing, the silence grew heavier, almost oppressive, as if something was watching me. I searched around, every muscle in my body tense. All I could hear was the wind rustling through the trees, but the stillness felt unnatural. Then I heard it, a crunch, sharp and unsettling, that made my blood run cold. I whipped around, flashlight in hand, the beam cutting through the darkness. My breath caught in my throat as my eyes locked onto the unimaginable sight just beyond the tree line. There, lying in the shadows, was the hiker, or what remained of him. His form was still, his clothes shredded, and there were dark stains on the ground. But worse than the body, worse than the sight of blood, was the thing crouching behind him. The creature was massive, its hulking form looming over the remains of the hiker. Its body was covered in dark, matted fur, and its head moved rhythmically with each deliberate crunching sound, as if it were tearing something apart. I could hardly process what I was seeing. Then it turned, its eyes meeting mine. They were dark and empty, filled with a hunger that made my skin crawl. Its mouth stretched wide, revealing jagged teeth glistening in the dim light. The creature let out a low, guttural sound as it rose to its full height, towering over the clearing. I could smell the heavy, foul scent coming from it. In its clawed hands, it held a piece of fabric, torn and smeared. It moved with an eerie ease, each motion slow but purposeful. I stood frozen, my flashlight trembling in my hand as I tried to process what I was seeing. This wasn't an animal. It was something far worse, something ancient. Then it let out a piercing shriek that rattled through my skull. The sound was unnatural, so intense that it made my ears ring. Before I could react, the thing moved toward me, covering the ground with terrifying speed. I fumbled for my gun, my heart pounding as I raised it. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to steady them. As it closed in, I fired. The first shot hit its shoulder, but the beast didn't stop. I squeezed the trigger again, this time hitting it in the chest. The creature stopped, its body jerking back from the impact, a harsh, angry sound escaping its mouth. For a moment, I thought it would charge again, but instead it turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving broken branches and disturbed ground in its wake. I stood there, breathless, my heart racing, trying to understand what had just happened. I glanced back at the hiker's remains, a reminder of the nightmare I'd stumbled into. This forest, once a peaceful place, now felt tainted. With slow, deliberate steps, I began making my way back, keeping my gun drawn, every sense heightened. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound felt like a threat. I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was watching me. Back at the station, the relief I felt stepping inside was overwhelming. I reported everything to my superior, describing every detail of the creature, the encounter, the way it had looked at me with those haunting eyes. He listened intently, his face growing pale as I spoke. By the time I finished, it was late. My superior apologized, saying I'd have to stay and give a full statement to the authorities. I nodded, too drained to argue. The station was safe, warm, and away from that thing in the forest. Hours passed in a blur of exhaustion and lingering dread. The image of the creature haunted my thoughts, the sight of its empty gaze, the horrifying shriek. I kept telling myself that I was safe now, that nothing could touch me here. But when the vehicles finally arrived, my relief gave way to confusion. I'd expected the local police, maybe an ambulance, but instead 2 black SUVs pulled up. The men who stepped out wore sharp, dark clothing, moving with quiet, deliberate precision. They didn't look like the local authorities at all. You're listening to Ghast. If you enjoy lying awake at night, questioning every shadow and sound, join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Hit subscribe to ensure you never miss a terrifying tale, leave a comment sharing your own brushes with the unknown, and don't forget to like this video. It helps other seekers of darkness find us. And now, back to our story. I felt a chill crawl down my spine as one of the men approached. He didn't introduce himself, didn't offer a hand. He just stared at me, his eyes hidden behind dark glasses. "Are you the ranger who encountered it?" he asked in a voice that was unsettlingly calm. I nodded, unsure what to make of him or his colleagues. "Good," he said, turning to the others. "We'll take it from here." It wasn't until that moment that I realized what was happening. These men weren't local authorities. They weren't even from around here. Their presence, their demeanor, it was as if they had been expecting this, waiting for someone like me to stumble upon the creature. And now that I had, they were going to take control of everything. I stayed silent, questions racing in my mind, but before I could speak, the man cut me off. "Your statement will be taken. You will be briefed later. We handle things like this." A sinking feeling grew in my stomach. There was no room for questions, no room for doubt. They had been waiting for this. Whatever this thing was, it was more than just a creature in the woods, and I had no idea how deep it went. After giving my statement, I tried to ask them questions, desperate for answers, but each man simply looked at me, stoic, emotionless, like they had heard it all before. Their eyes were cold, unreadable. They said nothing. Then one of them reached into his jacket and pulled out a document, sliding it across the table. It was a non-disclosure agreement, an NDA. I tried to read the words, but they blurred together as I realized what it meant. They wanted me to keep everything I had seen, everything I had learned, a secret, forever. I stared at the paper, my hands shaking. I didn't want to sign it. I couldn't. But their gaze was intense, and something in their eyes told me I had no choice. The silence weighed heavily around me. They weren't asking. They were telling. I took the pen. My fingers trembled as I signed, each stroke feeling like a piece of my experience was being locked away. The man nodded as I finished, slipping the document into his folder without a word. Then he handed me another sheet. This one was different, with tight, precise handwriting, spelling out a story I was meant to tell. A version of events that would be fed to anyone who asked. The man had been attacked by a bear. I arrived too late to help. That's what I was supposed to say, nothing about the creature, nothing about the horror I had witnessed. I looked down at the paper, a nauseating twist in my stomach. The lie was right there, a tidy story for the world, and I had no choice but to go along with it. I nodded. My voice caught in my throat, silently accepting the agreement. I wasn't sure what was worse, the horror of what I had seen, or realizing that I was now part of something far bigger than I could comprehend, something I was bound to keep silent. After that night, I quit my job as a ranger. I couldn't stay, not after everything I'd seen, everything I'd been forced to bury. I tried to move on, to forget, but the nightmares didn't stop. Sometimes I lie awake in the dark, hearing echoes of that awful night. I remember the creature, the twisted wrongness of it, and the way it looked at me. The memory still haunts me. What troubles me even more is the thought of the man's wife, who will never know what truly happened to him. Her voice on the phone, frantic with worry, still haunts me. The guilt eats at me because I couldn't give her the truth. She'll never know what really happened, and that weighs on me more than anything else. I used to love the woods, the smell of pine and the sounds of nature. The forest had been a sanctuary, but now it's a place of shadows, reminders of something I can't forget. I'm writing this now to finally get it out of my head. I know the risks, and I fear what might happen if they find out, but I can't keep this inside any longer. If you're reading this, stay out of the forest, please. It's not what it seems, and if you must go, take caution. There are things out there that should never be seen,